My name is Dr. Inez Petty. I am the founder of Education Today. My guest is Dr. Thomas L. Francis, founder of Pastoral Care Institute of Atlanta. He is also an adjunct professor with United Theological Seminary. So many times I run into different people who do not want to discuss grief because they feel like it's sad. What is sad is when we do not discuss the grieving process and we become stuck. So sit back, relax, enjoy the conversation, and thank you for visiting with us today. Can you tell us how you became a minister?
I became a minister after my father died, many years actually. I was working for Michelin Tire Corporation in Greenville, South Carolina, where I was raised. And after my father passed, I really became confused, angry, and disgruntled about God and the church, and I thought maybe that I felt maybe that God had done a bad deed toward me with the passing of my father, who was working so hard in the church to bring harmony to the city. He had integrated the school system. We were the first to go to integrated schools there, and I just felt it was unjust for God to take my father's life. So that took me down a road to really actually get out of the church and just kind of see where I was at that time and who I am. I actually went to another church, but that did not work out good. But the pastor was giving excuses for me not to become a pastor there. So after talking to the pastor who took my father's place, he asked me to come back home to that church. And then when I returned back to that church, in conferences and counseling sessions with the pastor, I realized that I was at the right place, and I became a minister there under him.
And tell us, how did you know that you wanted to work with people who were grieving and those who particularly dying?
Well, as I wrote in the book, as a child, I've always had an interest in death and dying. In that day, they didn't have too many educational outlets to learn about death and dying. It was more or less just experiences. So as a child, I would go down to the funeral home, which was on the corner of the residence where I lived. And I would go down there and hang around the funeral home, talking to the undertaker and stuff like that. But scared at the same time, but also curious. So I was led to just, as I grew up, I would do things like go to the hospital and visit church members. My mother was a mother of the community, and she would fix dinners for the elderly, and we would have to take those dinners out. We used to tease her that that was the Francis restaurant in the community. So following that road and going to seminary, and seminary I actually had an encounter when the professor was explaining different facets of ministry. And when he came to pastoral care and counseling, I set up. And after that class, I went up to talk to him, and he actually, that was really started me on my journey to become a chaplain.
We have people in our audience today who are stuck in grief. Can you explain to us what that is, being stuck in grief? Also, as a chaplain, you see a lot of anticipatory grief. If you can explain someone being stuck, anticipatory grief, and complicated grief.
Well, they don't necessarily happen in that order. So I'll start with anticipatory grief. That is someone who anticipates a loved one to pass in a short time. They may have anxiety or depression, sadness coming on because of the anticipatory death that's going to occur. So, and then when you say stuck, it would be more like a complicated grief. That is when a person has some other unfinished business with the person that has passed, and you have to dig deep to find that out.
And how does that work with if the grief is complicated? What's happening to someone when their grief is complicated?
Okay. Most of the time, and you do have to sit, let me just say this, you do have to sit with a person to find out what the problem is. But just speaking off the cuff, I see most people to have unfinished business. There was a lady that I counseled in Atlanta who, for some reason, saw ghosts and papers flying, and she said the phone was jumping off the wall. And I actually went there to talk to her, and I asked her if she just wanted me to pray for her or if she wanted to go deeper. She decided she wanted to go deeper because she wanted to be healed. So as I went deep with her, I asked her what was going on before her husband actually got ill. So she explained that they would always go on vacation together, and just before he took sick, he wanted to go on vacation by himself. And she said as she was leaving the airport, she saw a female come in that she knew, and she felt like they were together, but she could not prove it. So those type of scenarios cause complicated grief. And then shortly after that, he took sick, so she dropped it. So unfortunately, the feelings don't go away. They're buried at that time, but they resurface after the death. So she needed to complete that scenario of what was happening with them.
So how do you move someone through the grieving process?
Well, first of all, you have to see where they are in the grieving process. You have, as stated in the book of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, the stages of grief, anger, sadness, depression, then working your way to acceptance. So you have to actually talk to a person to find out what stage they're in. And ironically, every family member does not be in the same stage at the same time. And this is what causes confusion. It brings havoc in the family. So it's like a roller coaster going different ways. You know, you have one person sad, another person angry, and in their communication with each other, it may strike out to be something ill or something not tolerable in the family.
So and at that point, we have a lot of family members who get angry at each other. Can you explain how you diffuse that as a chaplain and what's going on with that family?
Most of the time, when you have a person that's angry, they're angry because their loved one has left them. The best thing to do, and as a chaplain, I've learned this, we have the family structure, and there's always going to be one person that's keeping a level head. We call that a Jesus person. That person is always your connection between you and the family. For instance, I had a group, family members who were at a hospital, and the doctor mentioned to me as I was coming in the hospital that the person was dead as a doornail. Well, the family member happened to hear that. So they became irate, wanted to harm the doctor. So we were all in the lobby there, and she was using profanity toward the doctor. And I saw the gentleman standing over in the corner who was quite calm. So I made my way over to him, and he was just explaining that the family was very upset. And I asked him to help me get them into the chapel. When we got them to the chapel, I was able to speak to them and calm the whole situation down. So from that point, I was able to talk to them, in a gentle way and passionate way. And that kind of diffused that situation.
How about, you talk about in your book about telling your story and the power of telling your story. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes.
And also, when you're, before you're talking about telling your story, you were talking about diffusing the situation. How would you tell us a little bit about storytelling or telling our stories? Or does that diffuse some of the grieving process, or how does that work?
Diffusing your story, actually what it does is unleash some of the isms that you have within yourself. Telling your story can help you find out where you are in life and the things that you have been through, how it contributes to what is actually going on now. This is good in any area, not only grief. It is good to know where you came from and some of the situations that you were in to understand where you are now and what you're dealing with at this time.
And I noticed that, as you were talking about the book and previously, is that a lot of times people don't feel safe telling their stories. So how can they, what would be the first thing they need to do to get started to deal with grief? And I know telling your story, you also say that it's a strategy to get through the grieving process. Can you tell us how somebody would get started, or what are some other things that they can do?
Well, one thing you would want to do is go back as far as you can, your very first memory, and come from there, just come up, talking about family members, your immediate family members, your father, your mother, your sisters, your brothers, your relationship with them, some of the events that happened, what made you angry, what made you sad, what made you happy, and share those events. As you talk about them, something will happen inside of you that's spiritual, and it will help you to get to a place of safe, where you can feel safe and that you belong, and have self-esteem, and then moving on into self-actualization.
Yes.
That's the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yes. Another area is when you're doing chaplaincy, and sometimes the people don't see family, they don't see their church, and then they're angry that they don't see their pastor or anybody, and you may be the only person that they see. How do you help people through their anger with God, their anger with family, their anger with their church, their anger with their friends, and they just seem to be so angry, yet they're dying? How do you separate or help them to separate what their anger is? Is it toward the people, or is it because of the illness?
Okay, we're all human beings, and when we actually get a diagnosis that we know is going to eventually cause us to transition, we become shocked for the first thing. Mm-hmm. And then we try to bargaining with God or someone that's close to us. I will do this if you just let me live. I will do this and I'll be better at this, and I will do this and do that. Those are bargaining tactics. And then you have anger. You may be angry because God is doing this to you. And not only does the patient feel these things, the family members can feel them as well. So these are emotional issues that we all have. Now, you have to deal with a person on each level. So for me, I listen. Listen is the number one key and the strongest weapon that we have against death and any kind of ill feelings that a person have. Listening to them, listening empowers them. If we listen to them, it gives them power to know that they are listening to someone is listening to them, and someone cares. Those are the most powerful things that a counselor can have is listening. So I heard someone say one time we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So we should listen more than we speak. But to get back to your answer, I think listening, understanding, compassion, and empathy, those are the things that will help a person travel from one stage to the other. And as a listener, you don't want to interject your own feelings on someone else or project your feelings on someone else. You want them to speak their mind, speak their heart. The best thing you can do when you counsel a person is repeat what they said. And that invoked them to move on to tell you more about what's going on.
So that's like a mirror to them, and they can see themselves as you're mirroring what they've just said. How do the patients move on when they're angry with their family and their church or their pastors or someone close to them, and they feel like everybody's forsaken them?
This is why I wrote the book, I Watched Them Die and Dying Lives Matter. It's not only about human deaths, it's about the dying of situations, people moving from one place to the other, separating from things that they really love. So when you have someone that has suffered grief, it does not only have to be a person that's laying in a bed. It can be a car. It can be a home. It can be a city. It can be a school. It can be a loved one. It can be a spouse. It can be a girlfriend or boyfriend. All of those things will cause you to grieve. Anything that's dear to your heart and you separate it from it, that can cause grief.
Dr. Francis, can you tell us about why you wrote the children's book, The Loon Family, where you want others to explain to children the dying process?
Yes. In my profession, I do eulogies quite often. So when I do these eulogies, I always notice the family sitting there. And I notice the little child sitting there, and the child is wondering, how should I feel? That's the expression that I see on their face. They're either looking at the casket, they're looking at their parents, or they're looking, just staring into space. They have nowhere to release what they're feeling. Once someone said that grief itself is like love with nowhere to go. So as I noticed that, I came up with a scenario of using balloons to illustrate the love that a family would have, and then losing a loved one. That balloon actually gets sick itself, and it becomes frail. And as the balloon becomes frail, it releases air. And I use the air to symbolize a spirit, Holy Spirit. And Father Loon actually explains to the children that the mother has passed, but she's forever with them. It's like the air. The air is here, but you don't see it per se. So the air represents the spirit of the loved one. This book that I wrote will be instrumental in encouraging children to ask questions about grief. Children have feelings just like we have feelings. and they don't often get a chance to express those feelings. You know, they have sadness, and when a loved one dies to them, a lot of them wonder what's going to happen to me. Was I the cause? Am I the cause of this death? So the book will provoke them to ask questions about the dying process and grief. And we should be honest with them. And we should not use terms like past with them. Because when you use terms like past, they think the loved one is coming back, that they just passed by. They're coming back, and they may be sitting at the door waiting on a loved one. No, those are hard words that you hear. Your loved one died. But we as clinicians and teachers, we need to be honest with them. They can receive it. It's in our psychic that we think they can't receive what we say, but they can. So we tell them that the loved one has died, they won't be back, they transitioned, and one day we will see them again.
And that's really important what you said about children can accept the truth. That's what it sounds like, and we shouldn't make up fairy tales so that they can deal with the grief. Even as adults, sometimes we say things that are not helpful. What are some of those things that we can say? What are some other things we can say to children to help them move through the grieving process? Is it important for them to tell their story as well as adults?
Well, you don't necessarily have to let them tell their story. They can tell different experiences that they had with the person that has died. They can share some of the good times they have with that person. You can ask them to tell, what did mom say to you about certain things. You know, I had a child who said he remembered his grandmother cooked apple pies. To him, that meant a lot. You know, it sounds small and petty to me, but I know it meant a lot to him. So those type things, you listen to them just like we would listen to anyone else. Allow them to express themselves.
I appreciate that. As a teacher, I know how much children are valuable, and sometimes they're treated as if they're invisible or that their feelings don't matter. But it would help a whole lot of family members and the children if we can allow them to speak. So I appreciate that book on the Loon family.
I just want to say that in the back of the book, in the Loon family, there's a perforated handprint, and where a child can actually put a dying person's hand on that paper and tread it with crayons or pencil or pen and have that forever in their lives. And I just wanted the audience to know that that's in that book.
Thank you for that. That's something tangible that they can do, and it's a project. And when children are learning, they learn by doing, and so when they're even doing something as practical as tracing the hand of a loved one, that will be a valuable memory for them. Yes. I appreciate you sharing with us.
Thank you.
Your wisdom is knowledge, and knowledge is very valuable. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for the Lord is there. His goodness and